Thank you, Mr Speaker. Today, the House joins the members of the Tasmanian, Armenian, Assyrian and Greek communities in honouring the memory of approximately 1.5 million Armenian men, women and children, and over 1 million Syrians and Greeks who fell victims to the first genocide of the 20th century. We condemn a genocide of the Armenians, Assyrians and Greeks and all other acts of genocide committed during the 20th century as the ultimate act of racial, religious and cultural intolerance. Recognises and honours the extraordinary humanitarian effort of the then newly formed Commonwealth of Australia, including Tasmania, for the orphans and other survivors of the genocide, which set a proud tradition of international humanitarian efforts by our state. We further recognise the importance of remembering and learning from such dark chapters in human history to ensure that such crimes against humanity are not allowed to ever be repeated. We further condemn and oppose all attempts to use the passage of time to deny or distort the historical truth of the genocide of the Armenians, Assyrians and Greeks and other acts of genocide committed in the 20th century, and acknowledge the 34 UN member states, including the US, Canada, France, Italy, Austria and Switzerland, that have recognised the genocide. Mr Speaker, I would like to acknowledge and thank the member for Bass, Ms Lara Alexander, for bringing this matter to not only my attention as Premier, but also to the attention of the House. And we welcome all members of the communities that I've just mentioned on this historic day in the Tasmanian Parliament. Because today Tasmania joins the states of South Australia and New South Wales in recognising the tragic events and the suffering endured by the Armenian, Assyrian and Greek populations living within the borders of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War and its aftermath. From 1915 to 1917, approximately 1.5 million Armenian and 1 million Assyrian and Greek men, women and children fell victim to a systematic and brutal regime that subjected them to mass murders, deportation and the destruction of their culture. Tragically, some of the most inhumane treatment was often reserved for women and children who were both abused and brutalised. This atrocity ended a 2,000-year-old Armenian civilization and over 100 years of suffering for the Armenian people as a result of these acts. Governments of the day, Mr Speaker, rightly decried this torturous and cruel treatment as a crime against humanity. I understand that there are 34 nation-states around the world who have subsequently officially recognised this tragedy. And I would like to honour the victims of this blatant and extreme abuse of human rights. I would also like to acknowledge the strength of survivors, as well as the profound loss of family, culture, homeland that you have all experienced. This was the first act of ethno-religious motivated mass killing for the 20th century. Tragically, as we all know, it would not be the last. Australia has a long history of humanitarian responses to human rights crises. Australian citizens and the Australian government responded to the plight of the Armenian people with courage, compassion and indeed resourcefulness. The Armenian Relief Movement in Australia gained momentum in 1916. The Friends of Armenia organisation was established in Victoria and began fundraising for suffering Armenians, though through concerns and church collections. By 1918, similar relief funds were operating in Sydney and Adelaide. These efforts resulted in the establishment of an Australian-run orphanage in Lebanon that could house 1,700 Armenian orphans. Prime Minister Billy Hughes established free transport for Armenian refugees aboard the new Commonwealth Government line of steamers. By 1960, approximately 500 Armenians had migrated to Australia, and more would follow throughout the decade following political disruption in the Middle East. The Australian government facilitated the entry of Armenians, Italians and Greeks from Egypt. Today, almost 60,000 people of Armenian descent call Australia home. This is a shining example of the role that both individual Australians and the Commonwealth can play in responding to humanitarian disasters. This story has been repeated in the way Australia has responded to humanitarian disasters throughout the 20th century and indeed today. This includes being an original signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, accepting over 170,000 displaced people following World War II, joining the UN Refugee Protection System in 1950, ratifying the Protocol to the Refugee Convention in 1973 and accepting an additional 12,000 refugees escaping conflict in Syria and Iraq, and the recent support provided by Australia to those who have fled Afghanistan or have faced war in Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights declares, everyone has a right to life, liberty and security of person. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment, and no one shall be subject to arbitrary arrest, detention or exile. It is the core duty of government to protect its citizens. No individual should fear harm from their government on the basis of their culture, religion, gender or political views. When crimes against humanity occur, such as those in Armenia, it represents a failure, indeed, of the international community to protect human rights. It is crucial to remember and acknowledge such atrocities if we are to learn from them and prevent them in the future, Mr. Speaker. This must happen from the international community and the regimes responsible for the acts. Mr. Speaker, by acknowledging and truthfully remembering events like this, critical international change can occur, such as the establishment of the United Nations and the Declaration of Human Rights following the Holocaust in World War II. Events of this nature remind us of how lucky we are to live in Australia, one of the most prosperous nations on earth, rich in its multicultural diversity and harmony. Our beautiful state, Tasmania, also has a diverse multicultural community that has welcomed people from around the world who have come to our wonderful state of Tasmania to enjoy the freedom, the prosperity and rich natural environment that isn't always available to those in other lands around the globe. As always, we stand ready to welcome refugees who are escaping human rights abuses. Mr. Speaker, today the House comes together as one in recognising such tragedy, such appalling and inhumane treatment of fellow human beings. We must always continue to fight against injustice, but most importantly also recognise that when injustice occurs, that we call it out, we acknowledge it. This is an historic day for the Tasmanian Parliament, and I want to thank all of those from all communities, Armenian, Assyrian and Greek populations, represented here today in person. We stand with you all as one.
Thank you. Honourable Leader of the Opposition.